all about the good quality of sleep and how important it is for our well-being. So during this online night surgery, we'll be discussing the importance of good quality sleep. And as we know, London is a global 24-hour city with a wide range of activities and services taking place at night. So there's lots to get stuck into. Just wanted to point out we will be recording this session. So Satu, if you could press record or have someone from the team press record, is that possible? I just know we have a lot of people from outside.
We're recording.
Great, fantastic. We have a few guests representing other countries and cities around the world as well, joining us for this night surgery. And we have a sort of global night czar, night mayor, night advocate WhatsApp chat, and mentioned that we were doing today's session, which sparked off lots and lots of interest from around the world. So recording this session means that those that can't be with us due to time constraints or time zones, that we'll be able to share this more widely. So thanks for your participation. So we want to help ensure good quality sleep for night workers and residents form part of a borough's nighttime strategy. And this includes careful planning to help insulate residents from the sounds of the city, and also partnering on initiatives to promote the well-being of night shift workers. So imagining that someone who works overnight is trying to sleep during the day, and with a third of our workforce regularly working at night here in London, this is something we really do need to consider. So adequate soundproofing is something that benefits not just those who sleep at night, but also those who sleep during the day because they work at night. So we're going to hear from sleep and well-being experts and sound management consultants on how the requirements for sleep and sound can be better managed in our cities. And just a little reminder that the new London plan includes the agent of change principle. Now, this is the principles outlining for planning mixed-use neighborhoods and how best to strike the balance between protecting residents from nuisance and noise, while also protecting the viability of nighttime businesses. So this policy places the responsibility, and this is a quote, responsibility for mitigating impacts from existing noise and other nuisance-generating activities or uses on the proposed new noise-sensitive development. It's a bit of a mouthful, but basically it means that if you are new to a neighborhood, and there's, and you are changing the makeup of the neighborhood, then you are responsible for that. And so we've seen this with developments of flats going next to, for example, nightclubs. And the onus on mitigating that noise should be on the new development, not on that original, often cultural nighttime use. So the policy also states quite a few other kind of quite wordy things that for your benefit, I am not going to read out loud, but I'm rather going to copy and put in the chat so we can refer to it, because this agent of change principle is potentially a game changer and something that we've just begun consulting on the new London plan that won't come in for a number of years yet, but we realize that the policy as it is now may need some strengthening. So our discussion today will help open up some of those considerations. Now, despite these policies, the rollout of permitted development rights has seen a rise in housing on high streets and in our commercial centers. And it also, this kind of limits the extent to which planning authorities can demand noise mitigation or soundproofing. And we'll see much more of this in years to come. So it's important that we get it right. Anecdotal evidence from across the hospitality sector suggests that noise complaints against nighttime businesses are on the rise. And data from the early pandemic showed an increase in the number of noise complaints raised against neighbors in residential areas. And it's also worth noting that the top reason that neighbors complain is not about noise from nighttime businesses, it's rather noise from their neighbors. So it's neighbors complaining about other people rather than these nighttime businesses. But we're aware that sometimes those businesses take the flak. So there's lots to be thought about here in this great balancing act. And I'm delighted that we've got a great selection of speakers for today's session. The first part of the session will look at the links between sleep and health. We'll first hear from Sarah Douglas, who is the director of Liminal Space, who's going to tell us about the work that they do connecting sleep researchers with the night workers and their employers to develop good work standards and healthy working practices. Then we will hear from Ben Fenech, who is the team leader for noise and public health at the UK Health Security Agency. Now, Ben will be detailing some of the specific ways through noise and sound impact our health and well-being. Then we'll have a short Q&A. And then we'll move on to the second part of the session. We'll look at planning and management practices that ensure we have access to good sleep. And so we'll first hear from Peter Rogers from Sustainable Acoustics about the design and planning solutions that can help support our vibrant nighttime and also enable good sleep. And then finally, we will hear from Jody Norman at Notting Hill Genesis. And they will tell us a bit more about how developers engage with these challenges and how they balance the, desire to create these active places at night while also making sure that their residents can sleep and have that kind of good balance of well-being in their lives. We'll then end with another short Q&A. And so what I'd encourage you to do is to use the chat function. So any questions, queries, comments, we'd like to have a bit of an active chat going on while the discussions are taking place. So please do feel free to use that. I will say that we've got in total until an hour and a half, so until 1 o'clock for this. If it does wind up earlier, it's okay, but we will have to wind up at 1 should this discussion be so fascinating that you want to carry on for another few hours, but we can always make sure and facilitate that at a later date should that happen. So let's move on. Let's discuss sleep and its importance for well-being. And I will now move to Sarah Douglas, the director of Liminal Space, who will speak to us for about 10 minutes or so. Over to you, Sarah. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks, Amy. Hi, everyone. I have to apologise. I've got a bit of a winter cold going on, so I hope you can still hear through that. I will talk to you a bit about the health impacts of night shift work. The company that I run, the Liminal Space, we use art and design to engage people with difficult, challenging social topics, many of which centre around health and health inequalities. And health inequalities is something you see very much manifest on the night shift, because we're often talking about people who are working low-income roles, who might be balancing night shift work with childcare, caring responsibilities. So it's not just the impact of night shift work that's having an effect on their sleep, but there are many sort of wider life factors that they're balancing. I will talk to you about these health impacts and about the program that we've created, which is called Nightclub, which works with night shift workers and employers of night shift workers to help mitigate some of those negative health impacts of night shift work. Thank you for sharing my slides, Daniel. That's really helpful. So it'd be great if you could move on to the next couple of slides. So on thinking about sleep, if you could move to the next slide, that would be great. Thanks. how did you sleep last night? So that's one of the first questions that we ask participants in our project. And really the reason why this is so important is that we find that in the workforces that we're working with, they are often majority male workforces. They're often very low income, low paid roles. And we find that sleep is just a brilliant gateway topic to talking about some of the wider health issues that people are facing. So when you ask people how they feel, you might not get very far, but when you ask people how they slept last night, you often open a whole can of worms. But we find that is, a brilliant way of getting people talking about some of the wider life issues that they might be facing. If you could have the next slide, please. So what are those issues? So we know, for example, that people who work nights are at risk of a whole host of health conditions, from cardiovascular disease to cancer to diabetes to mental health issues. So the evidence is all there for the health impacts of working at night. Very, very serious health conditions. We know that they get worse with age, and we know that they get worse with the number of years service. We also know that 1 in 5 people work nights in the UK currently. Over 7 million people were working nights during COVID. Over 50% of key workers are night shift workers. So you're really thinking about the kind of workforce it is that we're talking about. And as Amy says, huge proportion of these represented in the City of London and working 24 hours in the city. We know that accidents increase at night, but we also know that the cost to the economy, this is not just a health issue, but the cost in terms of absenteeism, attrition rates, presenteeism, cost the UK economy an estimated 50 billion per annum. So there's a great cost, as well as there is obviously an income generator to working at night. So the next slide, please. So I've mentioned some of these stats already, but one of the really striking ones for me is that night shift workers are 6 times more likely to get divorced than the average population. So we know that working nights has a big impact on people's, never mind just the health factors, but the wider well-being factors that people are facing working at nights, and that they're 75 times more likely to feel left out at work than other employees and then people who work days. So that's really where the nightclub intervention comes in, and I believe that's my next slide. I first have to tell you about cognitive impairment on night shift. So this is a nice but also fairly shocking stat, which is that your cognitive function between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. is the same as being legally drunk. So this is one that should really get employers pretty startled, because one of the things we know is that mostly for organisations, there's no sort of drop in KPIs depending on when you're working. There's no additional support for people at this time of night. Yet this is when the accidents are happening. This is when we know that people are typically working legally drunk, because of the cognitive disruption that they're facing from their circadian disruption. So onto nightclub as a solution. So what does our programme do? Well, nightclub is an intervention that takes place in employees' sites of work. We've worked with over 30 different employer partners now, including the NHS, Network Rail, retail sector, across the retail sector with partners like Co-op, Aldi. We're working across all sectors, looking at facilities management teams. And really how the programme works is it brings researchers, it brings employers, and it brings employees together to understand what better working conditions would look like for night shift, and to help communicate some of the basic but often ill-understood facts around night shift work and health, and what the differences are that employees can make, which often it looks at night shifts, how shift patterns can be changed, nutrition, noise, which I know is the big subject for us all today, and then look specifically at what night shift workers, what mitigating actions individuals can take in their daily lives. So what I've got following And you can just share these, Daniel, as a slideshow. Really is essentially lots of images, because we are a design consultancy, so we have lots of images around our work, and essentially showing how the nightclub intervention works. It's a pop-up shipping container. We've got 3 or 4 different models. One is a pop-up shipping container that travels to sites in need across the UK. So this is an image of where we took the intervention to TfL, to their bus garages across London, to work with bus drivers. And similarly, we've taken our shipping container to warehouses. You can see the interactions taking place inside are working with psychologists and sleep scientists who are bringing that direct intervention directly to night shift workers themselves. It takes place at night. Mostly. We work with our employer partners to identify the best times to run the programme, but we found that that is really one of its most unique features, is that there are not health and wellbeing programmes for this sector of the working population that take place at night. Mainly, they are asked to come off their shift to take part in health and wellbeing interventions during the day, which of course doesn't contribute to good sleep. So can share, this is our intervention with the NHS. So we've now had to, every site that we work with, every employer partner that we work with, we are developing new iterations of the programme. So you can see this is our pop-up model, which we use in hospital settings, because we don't want to take the place of ambulances with our giant shipping container. So everywhere that we deploy it, we've changed it slightly, and you'll see in a couple of slides time that we have deployed a trolley version, because we found that working with the NHS, we can't actually get anybody to come off their shift ever. So we've had to create a trolley version that literally goes directly to the workforce. So that's really what we're trying to do through this programme. There you go, there's Ron with our trolley that goes to different wards across the hospitals. We've worked with 6 different NHS trusts now across London and the UK. What we're seeing, I'll wrap up on the benefits. So what we're seeing in terms of the benefits are that we're seeing that employers are really seeing uptick in engagement within their teams. We know engagement is traditionally very low on night shift, so we're seeing improvements in engagement. We're seeing reductions in absence rates. We're seeing reductions in turnover, in attrition rates. All of these have a significant uptick on the bottom line of our employer partners. We're also seeing a great will within our employer partners to really come together to raise the profile of night shift workers and to raise the profile of this issue. And that's contributing to some wider policy work that we're doing, both London-based but across the UK, working with our employer partners to really look at what policy changes can be made in this area with regards to employers really having a more of a duty of care when it comes to night shift workers and being part of the solution. So that's a whistle-stop, slightly breathless tour of nightclub and the work that we're doing there, which is very much ongoing. And yeah, welcome any questions that you might have around how the programme works, some of its benefits, and I can do my best to answer questions on the science. I have to say that we have a very strong partnership with Oxford University and King's, who help us with the science to make sure that it's all based on the leading research in this area.
Great. That's so brilliant, Sarah, and thank you for powering through with your poor voice. We really appreciate it. We've got a number of questions in the chat, which I'd encourage everybody to use. We'll come back and answer those after our next presentation, so that we take your presentation and Ben's at the same time with the Q&A. So Ben Fenech is a team leader for noise and public health at the UK Health Security Agency, an acoustic specialist with an expertise on the health effects of exposure to sound. and noise. And he's been leading the team at the UK Health Security Agency on this since 2013, working with policymakers in governments and academia and communities, etc. So I'm going to turn over to Ben now. And thank you so much, Ben, for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, pleasure. Thanks, Amy, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you. Can you see my screen I'm sharing? Brilliant. Okay, so yeah, it's so in the next 10 minutes, I'll give you a very brief overview of the scientific evidence on the effects of environmental noise on sleep. Here's a brief synopsis. I'll start with some mechanisms, how sound affects sleep. I'll then just give you a brief overview of the current scientific evidence, and I'll finish with some known unknowns. So, as Sarah has already mentioned, there's lots of evidence about the importance of sleep to health. So then the next question is, what affects sleep? And again, there's a lot of different factors, many picked up by Sarah already. I'm just going to talk about one of them, which is sound. So why does our body react to sound during sleep? It so happens that it's a very convenient way how to alert us to danger. And that means that our hearing doesn't switch off at night and our brain continues to process the sounds we hear whilst we're sleeping. And our evidence on this has been significantly improved over the past 20 years, thanks to these kind of studies using polysomnography. And that's a scientific method where you're measuring a number of parameters, such as brain waves, heart rate, eye and body movement. And those studies link those to the sound recorded in people's bedrooms, where you can relate the effect of specific sounds is having on sleep. And this is the kind of data you get from those studies. And I know there's a lot of things, so I'll take you through it. So starting from the bottom, so this is an hour during the night between 3 and 4. Here we have where noise is occurring. So for this particular study, it's aircraft flyovers. And then next up is what's called the hypnogram. So this tells us in which stage our sleep in. So we have 5. So W is for awake. REM sleep, most people will have heard of. You have S1 and S2, which are called light sleep, and S3 is deep sleep. And experts believe that REM and S3 are the most important parts of sleep for our health. So if we start from here, you can see that this person was in light sleep, and then a noise event happened that took them momentarily to awake and then back to light sleep. That doesn't mean that this person opened their eyes or were consciously awake. This is momentarily. Then they went into deep sleep, but right at that moment, there was a noise event happened, which took them to awake. And importantly, they didn't go back to deep sleep. They went back to light sleep. The third event didn't have any effect. So not every noise event will have these, what we call arousals. The fourth one had a more pronounced effect. So they took longer in awake and longer to go back to light sleep, and so on and so forth. And finally, on the top, the squiggly line, that's our heart rate. And you can see that every single noise event increases temporarily your heart rate. So that kind of like gives us a good understanding of the mechanisms. And in terms of like summarizing that, so you have the characteristics of the sound itself, but also importantly, there's individual and situational moderators. For example, the age, how noise sensitive you are, current sleep stage. So those 3 factors affect the physiologic reactions related to a single noise event. But then those combined over a nighttime period or over your sleep period result in the disturbance fragmentation of the sleep structure for the whole night. And we know that has short-term effects, like Sarah said, in terms of reduced performance and increased sleepiness. But we also believe that if that happens over a long period of time, then that leads to long-term effects, like such as high blood pressure and increased risk of heart attack. If you are interested in this area, I can strongly recommend that you look at the systematic review on sleep disturbance due to noise, which was commissioned for the WHO noise guidelines from 2018, which is this one. If you don't have time to read that, then I think this is a very good kind of like very brief summary of the evidence. And that's nighttime noise can prevent sleep structure. Importantly, these effects do not seem to habituate fully. So this is a question I get asked very often. So do we get used to the noise? No, we don't. So these studies are carried out in people's bedrooms. These people have been living next to the roads, next to the railways, next to the airports for a long period of time, but we still see these effects. It's important to recognize that the noise-induced sleep fragmentation is less severe than in sleep restriction studies. However, we still believe that it may lead to the development of disease in the long term. To complicate matters, there's another domain of sleep disturbance, and that's how people rate their sleep. Kind of like if you ask them, for example, the morning after, how well did you sleep? People can rate. And we have this also body of evidence where we get the percentage of people who rate they were highly sleep disturbed because of the noise. And as you can see, it's based on average noise throughout the nighttime period. And for the same level, aircraft noise is judged to be more sleep disturbing than road and rail. So that's a brief summary of the current state of the evidence. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about evidence gaps. And the first one is about sources and characteristics of sound. So most of the evidence we have to date is from transport. That's aircraft, road, and railway. We do have also studies from ICUs. As you can imagine, they are very noisy environments, and there's concern about how noise affects recuperation. There's some emerging evidence on wind turbines, but for a lot of sources, which I believe people in this virtual room are interested in, there's very little or no evidence. So this is an important evidence gap. However, if we can try to relate the evidence what we do have, there's two important things that are important for physiological sleep disturbance. And that's the Lmax, the instantaneous maximum sound level is important. And also what we call the rise time. How quickly is that sound increasing? So for example, a door slamming or a glass bin being emptied is much more likely to give you that very steep rise time and hence those awakenings. The second gap is about individual differences. So most of the evidence to date has been on healthy adults, and that's done to try to minimize the amount of confounding in these studies. But even within that relatively homogeneous group of people, you still see large variations in their sleep patterns. So in this particular study, they compared the most sensitive to the most resilient people. And you can see that there's much more of these awakenings in the sensitive person. So that was the conclusion. So that's just in a healthy adult population, we see these large differences. And then the next step, though, is vulnerability. As Sarah mentioned, if you have irregular shift patterns, then we anticipate that your effect on sleep is going to be more pronounced. Similarly, for people with pre-existing sleep disorders. And finally, we are missing evidence on the effectiveness of interventions. And this is important because noise doesn't exist in isolation. So for example, you can try to reduce the noise level in the bedroom by sealing it all up. But if that means that you increase the risk of overheating, then you probably not going to improve this person's sleep. And this is a nice figure just to show the complexity of sleep. So the green bit, we have noise, we have temperature, we have light from an environmental perspective, all affecting sleep. But we also have psychosocial demand and also evening mind states. And this is where it gets complicated, where annoyance and people's perception of noise can interact with their physiological reactions to sound. Having said all that, the few studies there are on interventions about noise for sleep do show that if you reduce the noise, so this was a study in the late 90s from Sweden, there was a significant reduction in road traffic noise, and you do see large improvements in sleep. And interestingly, in people reporting windows open more often. I'll leave it there. Hopefully this provides some nice context for the next session, and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Ben. Really interesting. And I think it's opened up a whole bunch of more questions for us. And we've had a few in the chat. So we've got some time now for Q&A for both Ben and Sarah. But I'll start just by reading out Stephen Waring's question. He's asked if people are differently impacted by noise during sleep. For example, some people are just lighter sleepers, for example. Others, their head hits the pillow and nothing's going to wake them up. How do you mitigate for the difference in our physiological makeup?
No, absolutely. A very good question. And kind of like the limited evidence we have about this, I'm aware of just a handful of studies tried to look at individual differences. We know it's an issue. I don't think we have sufficient evidence to deal with it, but I think we have sufficient evidence to say we can't deal with this by just looking at the average person. We do have to take this into consideration. Obviously, how we do that, that's the million-dollar question. Perhaps the other thing to note is what has been observed as well is that some people might say subjectively, I'm fine, the noise doesn't bother me, doesn't affect my sleep. But actually, if you look at their sleep patterns, you see that the disruption is still happening, but they're just not aware of it. What's missing then is the link, how much of that disruption can be tolerated, so to speak, in terms of how much of it will translate into more serious health conditions in the future.
Do raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. I'll pose Paul's question. Are there any studies on daytime sleeping versus nighttime sleeping? Because of course, you've been highlighting nighttime noise, but what about those who sleep during the day? It's far noisier during the day, and I imagine that those that are working at night, I mean, we've seen through Sarah's presentation that those that work at night suffer, greater health implications, and that's due to the inequalities, including the fact that they're sleeping when it's the noisiest, but we're not really thinking about those people, are we? Or are you, Ben? I don't know.
Well, yeah, no, again, a very valid question. And I don't think there's, from a noise perspective, there are, certainly I'm not aware of studies looking at people sleeping during the day, specifically from a noise perspective, but I believe there are studies looking at sleep in general. But you're right, when we're talking about protection of sleep from a noise perspective, we talk about limits or conditions for nighttime noise, but recognizing that daytime noise will probably be higher, and there are people sleeping, and we're not protecting those people.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because it seems like, you've done an amazing amount of work on this, but the gaps and the evidence are quite huge, particularly when we're thinking about that traditional kind of bars, pubs, and clubs, the nighttime cultural offering in our cities. Mark Adam Harold, who's joined us from Vilnius in Lithuania, he's one of my colleagues who looks after nighttime in that city has made a good point. Nightclubs don't make sudden noises. It's a kind of like that kind of low thumping sound, I guess you could say. How does that impact? Would that be more likely to have a lower impact than, say, someone like you gave the example, Ben, of somebody emptying loads of bottles, from a recycling box or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think the honest answer is we don't know. I'm aware of, for example, one study which tried to look at low frequency noises compared to high frequency noises in relation to ground bore noise. For example, if you think the London Tube going under homes in a tunnel and you hear that very low frequency rumbling, that particular study seemed to suggest that we are not as sensitive to that kind of sound than to more high frequency sound. But it was a small study in the laboratory, so it's very hard to kind of like have the confidence to stand here and say nightclubs are fine, or kind of like that thumping low frequency noise is fine. You just need better evidence.
Better evidence, absolutely. Andrew, you've got your hand up.
Hello. Yes, I'm just interested in this thing around noise sensitive people. I mean, what proportion of the sort of population are we talking about? Are there sort of particular types of noise sensitive people? And I suppose as well, if someone is noise sensitive, are they generally likely to remain noise sensitive throughout their lifetime, or is it something which can personally be mitigated or improved in some way? I just wonder what the evidence is on that, please, as well.
Interesting, really interesting. Can we desensitize them over time? Over to you, Ben.
Okay,
Not talking about the ethics of that. I'm just, it just popped into my head.
That's right. So noise sensitivity. Let's talk about noise sensitivity first, and then how it links to sleep. Noise sensitivity. We do have evidence from surveys such as the Noise Attitude Survey carried out by DEFRA, which suggests that roughly 20% of the population we could call highly noise sensitive. But again, that was how we used to talk about things. But now we're moving towards more kind of like language in line with oral diversity. It's not like you're either not sensitive or highly noise sensitive. We are kind of like different shades of gray, if I may use that expression. We are all kind of like, if you ask people how sensitive you are noise, you get from a rate from 1 to 7, you get responses in every single one. But if you group the highest rating, 6 and 7, you get about 20%, so 1 in 5 of the population. In terms of can we desensitize it, it's noise sensitivity is a trait, so it's not kind of like it doesn't tend to change quickly over time. In terms of how it links to sleep, we know it links to self-reported sleep disturbance. So when people are answering a questionnaire, how well did you sleep at night, or did noise disturb your sleep? Whether that noise sensitivity is affecting our physiological responses, again, I'm afraid the answer is we don't really know.
Lots of questions, lots more questions than answers. Blanca has said, do you have any evidence on women being more sensitive to noise than men? An interesting one, because I'd be interested to know if this average person, is male, white, etc., as we're used to hearing in medical studies.
Yeah, again, a tricky one. There is some evidence which may suggest that women in certain age groups may be more sensitive to some sounds, particularly low frequencies or high frequency sounds. But again, it's kind of like, in terms of the quality of the evidence, I wouldn't say it's super strong, but there is, yes, some evidence which may suggest.
Interesting. And Stephen makes a really good point that some people, for example, those who are autistic or neurodivergent, can be very highly sensitized to noise and light and others, sensory stimulus. So that's worth bearing in mind. Just a short anecdotal thing from myself before we move on. That is a nursery I know of in the States. When it's nap time for the kids, they turn the radio on really, really loudly. And that is to help the kids be able to sleep in noisy situations, because once they go home and they're, they're in sort of big family situations, they're able to sleep regardless of what's going on in the background. Now, that's not scientific. Is it ethical? I don't know. I just thought I'd mention it because these kids are obviously growing up being able to like sleep in all sorts of circumstances. Anyway, I guess the point is they just want their kids to sleep through any means necessary. So we're going to have to move on now, and I'm aware that Ben, your final presentation kind of overtook the questions for Sarah, but please do. Is that okay, Sarah? Your voice is getting a rest. But if people do have other questions for Sarah and the excellent nightclub, please do put them in the chat. Right. Okay, time to move on to our next bit. And this is around planning for better management of sleep and sound. We've got two speakers. Peter Rogers, who's Director of Sustainable Acoustics, is going to speak with us for about 10 minutes. And then we will hear from Jodie Norman from Notting Hill Genesis. So over to you, Peter. Is that right? You're speaking for 10 minutes?
That's about right. I can squeeze in
Okay.
to whatever you need. And if there's time for questions, that's probably...
Yeah, we'll have a Q&A afterwards as well.
Okay, I'm going to try. Afternoon, everybody. I recognize some of you. Nice to see you. Those of you I don't know, hello, Peter Rogers. I've got some slides, but I'm going to be loosely using them rather than really to try and get through the amount that we need to cover. Please put in the questions, because I think this is all about exploring, the science versus the practical solutions that we can actually get on with now. And what I'm going to be suggesting is that we change our way of thinking around noise. Okay, that's the primary idea. And what I want to do is just set out why this is the case. So if I may just share, I don't know if that causes problems. Probably not. Can you see that? Great, thanks, Paul. So this idea of noise and vibrancy is something perhaps we're quite familiar with. There's a general idea that noise is the unwanted stuff in our environment, and the vibrancy is the good stuff. So how do we square that, how do we knock the edges off that and turn it into a circle or a balanced situation? It's really quite challenging, and we've been trying to do that for quite some years now. So this is just a bit of background in terms of myself. I'm a fellow of the Institute, so I'm a practitioner, and I know a bit about sound. Worked with Ben quite a lot, and it's great to have that presentation before this, because all of that evidence goes to underpin, and you can right off the bat appreciate that there are gaps in the evidence currently, and the primary reason for that is because we've been focusing so much on noise and the unwanted stuff from the Industrial Revolution, which has now led us to the point where now we have something of value and around the nighttime economy, and how do we tackle that? So that's the stuff I want to really be thinking about. So all familiar, hopefully, with the idea of the pillars of sustainability, and this is where it really comes into its own in terms of how we think about our cities. We can't think about any one of these in isolation, and it would be foolish to do so, because they're also interlinked. But what we're going to do is just focus on the fact that our people, places, and prosperity in the nighttime economy are interlinked. There's no point focusing on having a vibrant nighttime economy if all the people who live there in the city just cannot sleep. The city that never sleeps is not a good look. So what I'm just done here is just identify that when we're talking about places in terms of acoustics and sound, we should be really thinking around the idea of sounds as a neutral thing. Okay, noise is the unwanted stuff. Vibrancy is the interesting kind of concoction of various sounds that have a positive influence, and tranquility is essentially a place that is not completely silent necessarily, but gives us a sense of rest and break and recuperation from the unwanted stuff. And the important thing here is that all of these things shape our sense of place and belonging. So when we're thinking about neurodiversity and inclusion, we want to create places that everybody is able to happily exist wherever you are on that spectrum, that range. But yet that has to also exist with this idea of prosperity, and I'd prefer to think of it like that in terms of the global prosperity rather than just economy. And noise is quite often a block. But if you think about removing all of the noise from the environment, you end up with dead streets, and that's not a good thing either. You certainly don't have quiet, empty streets as a good sign of a healthy economic area. So then it comes back to our people and the fact that they need the ability to be able to sleep, rest, enjoy their leisure, and ultimately go out and party. So what does that, where does that leave us? Well, I think it's to remember that over all of this remains the planet, which sits there as the background, the backdrop, and the fact that for us to be successful as a species, we need to also remember that species health is important, and that our cities and need to consider how we as humans are going to work with our planet into the future. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. So these should not be a surprise to you. These are the sorts of sound sources that we're talking about in the nighttime economy. Be very familiar with things like the screaming fox down the bottom. You can argue whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, but the point is, it's a matter of context. I want to just draw your attention to this as really our current state of a call to action, which is from the UN and ultimately provides a really good framework for us to look at in terms of why noise and sound and health is important to whatever we do next. This is because they've identified noise pollution as one of the top environmental issues of concern, along with wildfires and the shifting of nature. So please have a look at this because it sets out some fantastic suggestions. And I'm just going to sort of flag some of the key figures there as the reason why. So think of it more as an environmental pollutant rather than just this idea of noise. Big figure, if we're thinking about one thing, it's really WHO and the fact that as an average over the night time, we are trying to be looking at bedrooms that are not providing noise levels higher than this, which is 30 dBA. Maximums, as Ben mentioned, are important. Up to 45 should be tolerated, but really, from that point of view, the lower the better. And also here we've got some numbers that are relating to outside conditions. So you can see that this is split into different sources, and generally transportation sources, which is where a lot of the evidence sits at the moment. Less evidence, as you've heard, around things like entertainment noise. So there is an assumption here that we are generally trying to not have too much noise in the area, but also what happens around the natural sound that we would have otherwise, and how could we possibly switch this into a more positive narrative. This is just a bit that starts us thinking along a different path, which is we can start to think about all of the other things which are in our soundscape, and the soundscape being a term that we are working towards using much more, because it neither decides whether something's positive or negative. And some of the sentiments that come out of the report are these. So access to quietness for people in public spaces is important, so tackling noise pollution, but also the fact that we need our cities to be hourly diverse and inclusive to support mixed use. Now, this is something I think we can all start to think about how this is relevant to us in terms of nighttime economy. This is just something, being silent is not the solution. It's the fact that we're trying to do something more than that, to be inclusive and diverse. A shift of thinking is we want to get really this idea that the unwanted sound and noise is one thing, but also that vibrancy, which is actually a state of being full of energy and life, and actually is linked to acoustics because it talks about strength and resonance of sound, that we want to think about what's the good stuff. And how do we think about that? Well, we don't actually have a word for that, or we don't commonly use it, but there it is. Pleasing to the ear is euphonic. So we can start to talk about sounds that are euphonic. So if we think about this idea of soundscape quality, and you can have a low quality, which generally you can accept would have noise pollution in, or a high quality. And that's going to change over day and night, etc. So this idea is to shift from the sound, thinking about the sound in its context, in this case the city, as perceived by the listener, who may be quite different, and may be sensitive, maybe not. And that is this idea of soundscape. And so if we think about how we start to pull these things together in places and people and to generate prosperity overall, well, for sure, we want to try and minimize the amount of pollution, noise pollution that people are encountering. And we should be aiming for this standard, WHO standard, in terms of bedrooms, 30, and tackling the implications in terms of burden for the disease. We can think about how to do this using planning and licensing strategies, and they should focus on this as a primary goal. Soundscape baselines are something that we are doing much more with these days in terms of quantifying what's currently there, so that if you have areas perhaps in Soho or other places in the city that are recognised for their vibrancy, that they are things that need to be quantified and protected. And that is as the residential comes in, so that you actually have an understood baseline. Otherwise, it just depends on when the acoustic consultant turns up and waves their meter around. The other thing is interventions over time. So we're absolutely clear as to what we're trying to achieve in terms of health and well-being and optimizing them. So which parts of the soundscapes and when should there be areas and times of respite. Also, this idea that in the same way as landmarks, in the soundscape, you have sound marks. So what are the bits of sound that create the sense of space and place, so that you get that sense of being part of where you are? That's quite important because people start to then understand and take ownership. Big Ben's a good example of that. And then consider good acoustic design early in the strategy, whether it be planning or licensing, because that enables people to put not only residents in unusual places, but also make sure that it doesn't impact on the businesses that are there. And I can't go past this without discussing briefly agent of change. I'm doing an awful lot with this at the moment, and what we have is this situation where the planning system and now the licensing system need to consider businesses not being unreasonably restricted. However, in reality, that is problematic in terms of making that work in practice. So it does require an agreement and a baseline to design to. So without the baseline, you can't really do anything. So what I'd say is that a joined up approach is to establish your baselines, to then be able to work out how you design to cater for your economic operations. Good examples: a Ministry of Sound, Hope and Glory case, the Nightingale in Birmingham as well. I can give you more information on those if you want them. Bad examples: a Night and Day in Manchester, which is ongoing and is something that I'm involved with. And there's an example where it just went wrong, and that was permitted development, allowing residential to get in too close and not be mitigated properly. In terms of things that we should think about, hopefully I'm not pushing, I'll be nearly finished, just wrapping up. Sound insulation, we've heard that mentioned already. Glazing is the primary one, but we need to watch out for things like overheating, because the balance is definitely there's a conflict between obviously keeping your windows shut and overheating. And there's a general sense that we don't want to be completely separated from our environments, and especially for soundscape, has periods of time when it's better, higher quality. And the other thing is that if you increase your sound insulation, that's fine, except to the point where low frequency isn't prevented from coming through. So you can make things worse if you don't get the specifications right. The other one is to think about sound insulation internally between residents. Current building regulations are a minimum standard. They're not particularly good. If you really want to be encouraging to prevent residents from being pitted against other residents, then an enhancement is wise. And remember that if development's going to happen close to the commercial premises, which is inevitable now, it's absolutely critical to get a specialist to consider what sound insulation is likely to be adequate or inadequate, because that's really on a case-by-case basis. And in fact, the building regs make it clear that should be the case. A specialist advice is needed, and quite often it's not happening, or there's the assumption that it would be fine just to have residential separation to a club, which is wrong. The other one is you can manage noise at its source, which is really where we need to focus on. You can use acoustic limiters with these days, which are much better. They kind of the compression limiters, they don't cut things off, but also doing impact assessments in the area. The reason for this really is to try and recognise the uniqueness of each locality. You can't really do one size fits all. That's not really how we work in terms of our response to sound. And this one, just interesting that was mentioned before, which is masking sound, ways to manage noise intrusion. It's absolutely valid to consider how perhaps the MVHR systems, the plant systems, which are providing you enough cooling and ventilation, can actually also provide you with masking sound at night, more stable level, because if your sound insulation is too good, then you'll be actually listening to all of the sound that's coming in through low frequency sound coming in through the glazing. So in terms of a reasonable balance.
Just to let you know, we just have about a minute left.
Yes,
for your
I'll wrap up,
presentation,
no
if that's
problem.
okay.
Thank you. So this is the wrap up here, which is designing for all is absolutely essential in my view. Yes, the law actually deals with the average person, but we're dealing with fuzzy data here, and neurodiversity means that we need to consider the area and what you want from that area carefully. I suggest that we do that through looking at vibrancy zones, actually identify areas in the soundscape where these are, and then consider how that might work with respite for residents. Tackle the misbehaviour in terms of proactively with the nuisance, remove the pollution, and recognise also people's risk for hearing inside venues, not just the staff. And plan for WHO conditions for sleep, so residents can sleep soundly. This should influence planning strategy as well as licensing strategy, and also gives the approach for enforcement. And so strategies for soundscape baselines and defining them is actually absolutely essential in my view, for us to then be able to make decisions as to how to improve health and well-being. There we go.
Thank you very much, Peter. Really appreciate that. Loads and loads of questions and comments been coming through on the chat. And we will move on to a Q&A after our next speaker, who is Jodie Norman from Notting Hill Genesis. Jodie is the head of placemaking and estates, community and socioeconomic development, and is really at the front line of making sure that housing is suitable for good sleep. So over to you, Jodie.
Thank you very much, Amy. Dan, could I just ask if you could share my slides on my behalf for me? That would be great. I'm going to, first of all, just give you a bit of an introduction to our approach to creating great places, to new development, and also to placemaking. So 10 years ago, effective property and estate management focused on providing clean, fit for purpose piece of real estate, operating within an efficient financial model that worked for both the tenant and the property owner. So there were rarely strategies relating to commercial lettings. However, that is no longer considered enough. The success of our mixed-use assets is increasingly determined by the provision of quality, experience, and a positive social value for local communities, customers, and our occupiers. A quality experience is no longer dedicated to the immediate house, flat, or apartment, nor just the service that's provided, but rather the entire end-to-end journey, which includes the estate and immediate and extended community. So creating places that reflect the needs and aspirations of people who use them is an instrumental part in achieving this. It's becoming a key element of assets placemaking strategy. So for house builders, our developments are getting larger and more complex. Like most developers, and quite rightly so, we're focused on planning, architecture, maximizing number of homes and costs. But it's become obvious that we don't do enough of the insight-led creative work to draw together the buildings and our residents and create a place and community that can both thrive, that they can both thrive in for the long term. So I've outlined on the slide here some of the issues and opportunities that are out. Some issues and opportunities that we face. So there is a need to be more open-minded, for us to be more open-minded and consider delivering 24-hour or late-night amenity in certain locations. We do need to create sustainable places for all. If you could just go to the next slide, please. So placemaking and neighbourhood creation is the process of creating vibrant spaces in which we live, work, rest, and play. The process has the ability to foster, unite, and strengthen communities and provide creative and commercial opportunities for our resident experience, but also help organisations establish a brand. Placemaking is simple, but it's problematic, multifaceted, and all-encompassing. There are 4 key principles that we consider when talking about placemaking, and if all of these are carefully considered on a long-term basis, in line with the place and those occupying the place, the outcomes can be transformative. So we are focusing on estate management, service, and management structure, from the boundary to the flat door, what is going on. Customers, people, and culture, who are they and what do they want? How are we communicating and engaging with our people? Brand, identity, and communications. Is there an identity and that is presented positively, and are we communicating properly with our customers? And finally, community, commercial, and socioeconomic development. Does a community exist, and what makes that community? So what does this have to do with nighttime economy, and how do we plan places for future with consideration for nightlife and our key workers? London is aspiring to be a 24-hour city. And in order to operate in this way, a more strategic and liberal approach to licensing and late night venues is required. I'm sure everyone is aware the UK music industry is at the heart of arts and culture. Studies on a 24-hour cycle of a city showed that late licenses and longer opening hours actually alleviate pressure, harnessing and enabling the creativity of nightlife. So when designing new schemes and curating ground floor non-residential uses, we do consider these 4 pillars of placemaking. The majority of developers, I would say, would shy away from embedding nighttime venues or late night commercial uses into mixed use schemes. This is largely due to the risk of noise complaints, antisocial behaviour, overall understanding of management, and uncertainty around occupiers. This is leading to an overall reduction in spaces. We should, however, consider strategic locations for specific late night uses and build with purpose. We need to understand movement through the new scheme, but also surrounding developments. For example, locating a popular bar or restaurant facing into a residential courtyard may not be desirable, but clusters of similar uses create a destination and in turn become easier to manage and contain any concerns. So there are small things that you can do and build into design. Considering the end user at a really early stage, which isn't always factored in. So creating barriers between residential and commercial units, uses such as awnings, canopies, mews-style buildings, locations over outside seating and terraces, high quality glazing in our residential properties. So as the new policy outlines, developers need to commit to these uses at an early stage and ensure that they have an appropriate base build specification. Peter talked a lot about acoustic treatment. Detailed work on this acoustic treatment is required at an early stage, so you can build that into to the tender process, and having on board a sound engineer to design for noise throughout the day and the night. We can utilize basements and increase floor to ceiling heights and make more attractive spaces that are actually fit for purpose. Access and egress is key. What is the direction of travel for visitors, and can this be separated from the main entrance to residential? So just back to the 4 pillars, with consideration for nighttime economy, estate management. So it's building in appropriate noise restrictions into tenant leases, having control over hours of operation. However, we can't be too restrictive, or these uses won't be viable. Landlord to carry out some element of the soundproofing. There is a capital barrier to entry where new operators may not have the capital to enter into the market. So Ben touched on this earlier. However, it's not just cultural spaces, bars and clubs, but also for gyms and similar uses where vibrations can be heard throughout the building. Customer and people, who is living within the development, who lives nearby. Consider tenure types and location for non-residential uses. So where are your key worker units located? They could be doing shift work, and they could be more suitable for location of nighttime activity. Family units to be located away from busy thoroughfares, and avoid flats overlooking places where people gather. Community and socioeconomic development. So consider tenant selection. We work with organisations and individuals who have experience in nighttime economy, have a community facing focus with strong social value. The more they integrate into the community, the less complaints they're likely to get from residents, and it becomes a partnership. So the developer can also stipulate that they employ locally, and this also makes sense for their business model. Having worked with a number of club and bar owners, the majority are very careful and considerate. In relation to ASB and also operating their venue, they risk losing their license and in turn their livelihood if it's not managed properly. And finally, brand identity. As a brand identity and communication as a developer, we need to develop concepts and stick to the brand and vision for a place. We need to communicate and be honest with buyers and tenants about the future uses and hours of operation. So saying all this is great. However, the provision of these spaces has to be driven by planning policy, and supported by local authority, licensing, and we need to ensure that the regulations allow for that. That's all. I think the agent of change legislation is very important, as Peter touched on. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that, and lots of food for thought, particularly around that the obligation, I think, of planning, and we'll take those learnings away as we continue our consultation on the new London plan. So now big thanks to all of our speakers. There's loads and loads of questions that have been being put up in the chat, but I'd really love for us to, oh, Daniel, I think maybe you can take that down. I'm seeing myself twice on the screen, which is a bit distressing. I'd like to open it up for a conversation now so that people can have a free and open chat about some of these issues. So who would like to jump in? Anybody want to raise your hand, bring in a point, ask a question? I'm still seeing myself twice, which is still a bit alarming, but I'm sure Daniel is working some kind of technological magic to get rid of it. Anybody want to jump in here with a question? If not, I've got loads of questions myself.
Amy, could I just try and thread some responses together that have come up in the chat? So
yeah, sure.
Great. So there's a few questions here around this idea of soundscaping, baselines and so forth, and questions mainly around, has it happened before? Is it occurring? And yes, it is. And what's really interesting is it's being funded by the developers. So as you can imagine, they are sort of quite desperate to get into key vibrant areas, and quite often it's where it's reached a deadlock. And this is the sort of approach that is enabling those things to be unlocked. So you can actually get into some quite deep design solutions, which are then funded by the developers, and enable the premises to get the mitigation in place at source, and then continue really what they're doing. So it's almost like a consequence of what's happening, sort of as a result. Then you get the soundscape baseline of, well, permitted music, for example, that sort of thing. And what I'm suggesting here is that could be a proactive thing that could be done in a more coordinated or strategic way.
Thanks. I think Paul Ainsley, I think you are sharing your screen, which may be at the heart of this.
Good morning, Amy.
vision.
Greetings from Canada.
Hi, Paul. I
I'm
think you might
having
be
trouble with my video.
okay. Yeah, I think you're sharing your screen. So if you could look into that, that would be fantastic. Thank you. So just on that note around bringing those threads together, and that developers are often funding this. I wish that I could say that I've had a really positive experience with this, depending on developers to find innovative, practical solutions on behalf of clubs and music venues and spaces that are at risk. We're working on a case here in London at this very moment. The entire thing is based on inaccurate levels of noise that has been measured a number of years ago, and the solution that was they came up with was around putting in some sound insulation that would reduce the floor space of the venue, which would reduce the capacity, which would reduce their takings, which would severely impact the business. So I think the onus obviously is on planning, as has been outlined, but really developers have to do better. They really
totally
must
agree.
do better.
Absolutely agree. And I think if I can just throw in a kind of incendiary suggestion, and that is that for far too long, in fact only until recently, planning and licensing have never spoken. This is a divide that has to change, because actually, if you think about it, you've got the hand on the tiller, which is the direction for planning, so the plan for the future, as it were, which is in perpetuity, and then you've got licensing attempting to tap things in a general direction. Those two things have to be coordinated, and I think part of the problem is that the developers are responding to what's there in front of them. They're trying to do the minimum, of course, that they need to, and part of it, I think, is therefore having a strategic plan, which ultimately tells them what is expected. And what I've found is that if you really push them and they don't have any other way to go, then they'll get there in the end with the right advice.
Yeah. Well, I hope it turns out that way for this particular venue.
Could I make a comment on that, actually?
Yeah, please do, Jodie.
So I think I do agree with you, but ultimately it has to be built into the viability of the project. And if developers want to build, then it has to make sense financially. So anything that's required to enable them to build, then they need to obviously take care of. However, I do feel like the difficulty is the hard work and understanding the needs and requirements of these venues is something that they could do with being provided, or having some guidelines or some base build information in relation to that. So if the GLA or similar organizations could do some work around like minimum standards and things like that, and specification, and different options for what could be done to mitigate this, so either to their development or to these venues as well, then I think having that information and being able to cost up those different things would really help come up with the right solution. Otherwise, they are going to look at the cheapest thing and the easiest thing for them, and I don't think that's necessarily the right approach, because it's not one size fits all.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Jodie, and it mirrors our exact experience of what we're going through at the moment. And Andrew has brought up a really good point in the chat. Andrew, I don't know if you want to sort of say that out loud. You'd rather
Yeah,
me
it's
read
just
it
this
out.
thing
I want to give you
about-
the
It's
chance.
this thing about offices, because we know there's likely to be more redundant surplus office space across London. And some of this will potentially be in proximity to cultural assets, and there's a huge demand for residential in the capital, of course. So I suppose in terms of the conversion of some of that space, given that a lot of it would have been built, I guess, in the sort of 60s through to the 90s, and I know it's really, really hard to make generalizations and it's all case by case, but I just suppose broadly in terms of additional push and enhancements that we should be expecting in terms of the acoustic insulation over and above those building regulation standards, because a 70s office block is a wholly different proposition to, you know, a lot of other build types.
If I may, then I'll throw some numbers at it, because I think it's really you know, don't hold me to this, but residential separation to residential is about 45. Okay, if you're talking about anything less than 55 for a resi to commercial, then you're going to have major problems. Now, what that really means in real money is that's adding a huge amount of cost to the sound insulation that's got to happen. If you're just taking a bog standard, you know, office to resi. So it's an absolute, you know, it's a top risk factor for whether or not that's viable or not. And unfortunately, what is happening is permitted development is allowing a back door for that to be done. And then this is the night and day case ultimately. It's fundamentally leading to a problem, which is then placing the venue under a lot of stress. Actually, I think the reality will be that there should be an obligation to some extent to venues to define what they think their output is. All right, that's really picking up Jodie's point. It's a good investment, because then essentially, as the developers come along, you can effectively share that data with them at a cost, you know, and start to recoup some of that. Because the other thing that's not fair is that the first developer through the door has to foot the big bill, and then everybody else trots through behind them. So to some extent, there should be some shared understanding. I think a great idea if there could be a strategic steer or some guidance that could help venues to prepare for that happening, because it's happening now.
I think also understanding the pattern of how you access venues as well. And it's not just about the noise that's made within, but actually when people come and go and the management strategy around that. So developers, that would be really useful for them to have that. Because if it's something that's working and they decide to build somewhere and there's now residential entrance in there, like the path of travel when all the patrons are leaving going towards the tube station, then that is going to become a new source of complaint. So it's about sharing all of this information so that they can factor that into their overall design.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I also don't want to. I don't want to lose the night workers in all of this that will be sleeping during the day, because nobody's doing sort of acoustic tests on, I don't know, roadworks, for example. Are they? Maybe they are. Maybe I'm missing out on this, but we're talking very much around noise made at night and not noise made during the day. And I'm wondering whether we need a more of a kind of holistic 24-hour approach to this, or whether that's really just, you know, too much wishful thinking.
No,
Peter.
I think you could do it. You could do it. I think because the reality is that your design strategy, you do it once, you know, and quite in some areas, in vibrant areas, it's often noisier at night. So, you know, the reality is that flips the thing. And the good thing about noise, as we're talking about, it's pollutant, is that when it's gone, it's gone. It's not like air pollution where it hangs around and you've got an issue. So you can make use of these two different modes. And I think it's just important that the strategy is clear for each area, and that you also understand where the respite will happen. You know, our place is sufficiently designed to allow somebody to sleep during the day. Well, somebody needs to consider the quality of the soundscape during the day. Ideally, we'd love for people who want to, you know, hear the bass or whatever, to open their windows and connect, and that's fine. I think that's a positive thing. much like the people as well. And that is that people don't generally like to be isolated. And if you're living in a box and you're shutting yourself in, then one of the things that we're looking at in terms of research is whether or not too much sound insulation can lead to your reducing well-being. So actually, you want connection to your community. And I think it just has to be more carefully thought through, really.
Other questions? Other questions for the team, the group that have presented? Paul Broadhurst, I know you put a couple of different comments in the chat. I wanted to know if you want to come in here.
I think they've mainly been answered. I had a question about the graph that Sarah showed at the beginning around your cognitive function sort of declining throughout the day and the night, basically. And I think Sarah has answered that. I don't know in the chat, but I don't know if you want to just answer that on the actual call, Sarah.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So the legally drunk bit. So we know that our circadian rhythm drops roughly between 3 and 5 a.m. and we also know there's a big correlation with accidents that happen at that time. I think that the most difficult thing we find for employers to get their heads around is that it does all depend on individual biology. That's the tricky thing. So we all have a circadian rhythm, but we all have a different chronotype, which is essentially whether you are a lark or an owl or somewhere in between, and that will be in your DNA. So a lot of the sort of longer term solutions that we're looking at with employers is, could you chronotype your workforce? Because ideally you'd never have, as the unions would love that, but you'd never have a lark working a night shift because the effect on their health would be extreme. So yes, they're sort of blunt tools to some degree, but we do know that in general terms, that is when people are suffering most, and that is where we kind of need to provide the most support at that time of the night. And it will definitely be exacerbated if you've been on a shift for a long time, if you haven't slept during the day. And I think I put in my point that although people do sleep during the day, we know all the research shows that they will be getting less sleep, they'll be getting poorer quality sleep, they won't be getting into REM sleep often, which is that really deep sleep, which is the kind of really restorative higher quality sleep that you need to function. And you'll be building up a kind of sleep debt, which is, you never get it back. You can't just kind of have a couple of good nights and get it back. So and to your point about noise during the day, that's something that we hear so much from our night shift workers. Amazon deliveries, lawnmowers, they will hate summer because of all of the so much more noise in summer, they claim. So I think it would be really interesting to think about the 24-hour city in that context.
That's really helpful, Sarah. I think I've got a lot of sleep debt stacked up from my past, but I guess it would also be helpful if we all knew if we were a lark or an owl and then managed our expectations accordingly, and sort of allowed room for, I'm an owl, allow room for the larks as well, and vice versa. But then, we'd be living in a utopia and we wouldn't have a need for any of this. So, but I think, it's an interesting point that you make. Right, we've got 5 more minutes, and I'm happy to wrap up early, but I also want to give everyone the fullest chance possible to share any thoughts or reflections with us. We've had a number of people joining us from around the world today, from running, as I mentioned, cities.
You have been unusually quiet, if I may say so.
Yes, I know.
Knowing these people.
Yes. Oh, good. Mark Adam Harold from Vilnius, who's actually a Brit. So you've left London to go and run Vilnius at night.
Run it? Yeah, I wish they would let me run it. I try and tell them what they should be doing to run it. But my question is about zoning, because we have quite a small city, and I quite often hear from bigger city people about zoning. Maybe their cities are big enough to need that, but in my city it would just lead to a massive corrupt battle about where we're going to draw the lines. So yeah, I see a nodding head, so I think that might be the answer to the question that I haven't even.
No, I think just to be clear, I mean, you know, we're talking about, you know, sound is invisible. Okay, so it gives you the ability to do a very soft zoning exercise, and what I find is that you could sit down with your kind of enforcement people, and they could probably do it with a marker pen. You know, they know what's going on without doing large costly surveys, but then it would be good to identify then which areas are the areas you're trying to protect, you know, and the areas where you could do with improvement in the soundscape quality, because you can use these as assets. You know, these are places that people can go day or night, and enjoy vibrancy, or know where they can access respite.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to know where it is, but all of the best nightlife areas in our city have exploded during the last 10 years in areas where I had no idea they were going to explode. And if you'd asked me 10 years ago to draw the map, it would have been complete nonsense. So I'm very allergic to hearing that we should start trying to draw the map, and that house is now
No,
a nightlife-y house, and that house isn't.
no, absolutely. I think it's really about, what I'm suggesting is that it's about if you're then going to allow residential in that particular area, it's recognizing that developer needs immediately to, it's a flag to say you need to consider these. It's not just a general thing, but actually this is an area that you're going into where you've got cultural assets that are important to the quality of the place. And in doing that you're actually, what you're doing is just triaging where the risks really around, because that's where the harm can happen. And what I see is when it goes wrong, you just end up with dead streets.
And we know dead streets are not safe streets either. When thinking about from a safety perspective, they're not economically vibrant, as you said, Peter. I think one of my big takeaways from today is that we need more data, and we need more relevant data. There seems to be huge gaps in data, particularly, you know, thanks to Ben for highlighting that. And it seems like there are decisions being made at quite high levels based on maybe not the most relevant data, or making assumptions around what the data may or may not say. So I think that's one of our big takeaways, Ben. Do you know if there are any data plans for the future to kind of bump this up?
From a UK perspective, I'm aware of an ongoing study on aviation noise, so more data on transport. For the other sources, there may be internationally, but yeah, it's a good discussion for the GLA. We sometimes think this data, it's only scientists or universities which can generate this data, but we need to, how can everyone, maybe around this room, can help to generate this data? It's not just like leaving it always to the scientific community or the research community. We are all researchers in what we do.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, that is a perfect way to end and to give us a challenge as we go on our way. And we will be sharing this recording around, so please do share it more widely if you can. And it's also for those around the world who weren't able to join us. We would love to also share the PowerPoint presentations from the speakers. So if you're all okay with that, we'll contact you and hopefully be able to share that more widely as well. So for now, I wish you a very wonderful rest of the day. Have a good lunch if it's your lunchtime where you are in your time zone. And I hope we get to see each other again soon. Thanks. Bye.